There is a photograph taken sometime around 1897 in a Cincinnati pharmacy not far from the Ohio River. The shelves behind the counter run floor to ceiling, packed with amber glass bottles and ceramic jars and paper-wrapped bundles of dried root, handwritten remedy cards tucked between containers labelled in careful ink: valerian, lobelia, echinacea, blue cohosh, golden seal, slippery elm. The pharmacist at the counter compounded his own preparations from raw plant material. He knew each substance by name, origin, preparation method, and action. He knew which bark reduced fever without depleting the body. He knew which root steadied an irregular heartbeat, and which tincture brought down inflammation after a winter's hard labour. He knew the difference between a preparation built for acute illness and one designed for long-term support. He could read a patient's condition and reach for something specific, not because he had memorized a pharmaceutical catalogue, but because he had been trained in a living tradition that had accumulated knowledge across generations. By 1925, most of those bottles were gone, not because they stopped working, because the people who made them were no longer allowed to practice. That is the detail the standard account buries inside words like modernization and reform. Medicine was standardized. Quality was raised. The chaotic landscape of the 1800s gave way to rigorous scientific training and institutional oversight. The story sounds like the natural arc of a civilization improving itself. What it leaves out is that this transition was not organic. It was not gradual. It was not primarily driven by comparative clinical evidence. It was driven by a specific document, released in a specific year, funded by specific men whose financial interests ran in a very specific direction. That document was the Flexner Report, published in 1910. If you have heard of it at all, you have almost certainly heard the version that calls it the founding moment of modern American medicine. That version is not entirely wrong. It is incomplete in ways that, once you see them, you cannot easily unfocus. Before 1910, American medicine had genuine problems, and honest accounting requires saying so. The 19th century produced patent medicines containing undisclosed quantities of opium, alcohol, and arsenic, sold over counters with claims no one had tested. There were practitioners performing surgeries with no understanding of antiseptic technique and no mechanism of accountability. The argument for some form of quality control had real weight. Nobody credible disputes that a completely unregulated medical landscape was acceptable. But the healing landscape of 1900 also contained something the textbook version moves past far too quickly: a functioning, genuinely diverse healing culture that had been operating effectively across much of the country for generations. It was plural. It was distributed. It served millions of ordinary Americans who would never have access to a university hospital. The Eclectic Medical College of Cincinnati had been in continuous operation since 1845. By the time the Flexner Report arrived, it had trained thousands of physicians in plant pharmacology, hands-on botanical preparation, and nutrition-based treatment protocols. Its graduates worked in cities and in rural communities, treating patients with preparations derived from a tradition that indigenous healers, immigrant communities, and generations of American folk practice had developed and refined across centuries. The school was not marginal. It was well-attended, professionally organized, and grounded in a clinical identity that its graduates defended with rigor. In 1910, the Flexner Report gave it a failing grade. By 1942, it had surrendered its charter. So what exactly had failed? The Flexner Report was not produced by the federal government. It was not written by a panel of practicing physicians drawn from the country's diverse medical traditions. It was commissioned and funded by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. The man who wrote it, Abraham Flexner, held no medical degree. He had never practiced medicine, never conducted a clinical trial, and never run a hospital ward. He was a school reformer, handed one of the most consequential assignments in American medical history on the basis of that credential alone. Flexner spent roughly 18 months visiting 155 medical schools across the United States and Canada. At many institutions, he stayed for a single day. He assessed facilities, faculty, and curriculum structure. His grading standard was not patient outcomes. It was not decades of accumulated clinical records. It was not a comparative study of what different methods achieved in treating real populations. His standard was alignment with one specific model: the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, which taught laboratory science, pharmaceutical chemistry, and a research curriculum built around synthetic compounds, controlled experimentation, and anatomical investigation. Schools that matched that model received favourable assessments. Schools that did not, regardless of how long they had operated, regardless of what methods they used, regardless of which communities depended on their graduates, received failing marks. The grading system was not designed to measure healing. It was designed to measure conformity to one's system of medicine. That distinction is the hinge point, because what followed the report was not a period of open professional debate. What followed was money, directed with precision. The Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, whose financial interests were by this point closely aligned, began channeling substantial grants exclusively to the schools the report had approved. Medical education under the new laboratory model was expensive. Hiring research faculty, equipping chemistry and anatomy departments, maintaining clinical training facilities at the required scale. None of it was possible without significant outside funding, and private philanthropic foundations were among the very few institutions capable of providing it. Schools that received Carnegie and Rockefeller grants survived and grew. Schools that did not could not compete, and the schools that did not receive those grants were, with remarkable consistency, the same schools the Flexner report had failed. Here is where the story stops being about standards and starts being about markets. John D. Rockefeller's financial operations by 1910 extended far beyond oil. Rockefeller was deeply invested in the expanding American pharmaceutical industry, which was importing and scaling a German model of synthetic drug chemistry. German chemical companies, Bayer, Hoechst, BASF, had spent decades developing compounds that could be isolated, synthesized, and commercially patented. Aspirin had been patented by Bayer in 1899. The logic of this model was clear. Identify a therapeutic compound, synthesize it in a reproducible form, file a patent, and sell the product through a distribution chain requiring licensed professionals to authorize its use. That chain required trained prescribers, specifically physicians trained to prescribe patented compounds rather than advise patients to prepare willow bark or slippery elm from plants available in any field or market. A medical school teaching plant pharmacology and botanical preparation was not simply a different kind of institution in this emerging economic architecture. It was a structural competitor. Its graduates did not need Bayer's compounds to do their work. The families they served did not need a pharmaceutical transaction to manage an infection, a fever, or a respiratory illness. Plant-based medicine, prepared at home or compounded by a trained herbalist, could not be patented. It could not be routed through a controlled supply chain. It could not anchor the financial ecosystem that pharmaceutical investment required to generate returns. Standardization was not neutral. It was a market reorganization wearing the language of science. The scale of what followed is the detail that almost no popular account includes. At the time of the Flexner report, there were approximately 155 medical schools operating across the United States and Canada. By 1935, there were 66. More than 100 institutions had closed, merged under financial pressure, or folded when accreditation was denied and enrollment collapsed. Among those that disappeared, every remaining eclectic medical college, the majority of homeopathic medical schools, most naturopathic programs, schools with significant black enrollment. The Flexner report explicitly recommended reducing black medical schools from 7 to 2, a recommendation carried out almost exactly as written, framed publicly as a quality measure, schools that had been training women in clinical midwifery and botanical medicine. The pattern of what closed was not random. The institutions marked as deficient clustered around schools serving communities. The new industrial medical model had no financial reason to reach. Black physicians training to serve black patients in a country where white medical institutions largely refused them. Women practicing midwifery where hospital birth was inaccessible. Rural physicians whose patients could not afford institutional care but had access to a knowledgeable local herbalist or a well-stocked botanical pharmacy. These were not the least rigorous schools in any clinically meaningful sense. They were the least useful schools to a system being reorganized around institutional prescription, manufactured products, and managed patient encounters. Before 1910, American healing culture had a density that archives mostly failed to capture, because so much of it was never institutionalized in the first place. It lived in family remedy books passed from mothers to daughters across decades. It lived in knowledge immigrant communities carried from Central Europe, from West Africa, from China, from Mexico. Peoples for whom plants had been medicine long before the first pharmaceutical patent existed. It lived in Thomsonian herbalism, which had moved across rural America in the early 19th century as an explicitly populist system, built on the idea that ordinary people had the right to understand their own bodies without being made dependent on a credentialed professional class. It lived in the tens of thousands of midwives who had delivered the majority of American birth throughout the 1800s, using plant knowledge that managed labour pain, supported uterine function, and kept women mobile during childbirth in ways that mainstream obstetrics would not rediscover for several more decades. None of this was primitive. It was distributed, local, community-held, and largely non-monetized. That non-monetized quality was the problem. A family that reduced a child's fever with elderflower and yarrow tea, brewed from plants at the edge of the property, generated no pharmaceutical sale. A midwife who supported a labour with red raspberry leaf preparation and positional guidance created no hospital billing event. A Thomsonian practitioner who treated a respiratory condition with steam and diaphoretic herbs wrote no prescription moving through a licensed pharmacy tied to a manufacturer's supply chain. The old healing culture was economically invisible in all the ways the emerging system required visibility. Every transaction it completed successfully was a transaction the new system could not capture, quantify, or monetize. When the eclectic medical college finally closed, the physicians it had trained did not simply retire. Some continued practicing in the margins of the new framework, in rural areas, in communities that still trusted them, where the new licensed establishment had not yet fully arrived. But they had no path forward inside the institutions that now controlled what counted as legitimate practice. They could not teach in accredited schools. Their methods could not be entered into approved curricula. The knowledge they held began its slow migration out of formal medicine and into the domestic and unofficial, into immigrant kitchens, into the oral traditions of communities whose relationship to official medicine had always been complicated by race, poverty, or distance from the centres where institutional medicine was building itself into permanence. The knowledge did not vanish overnight, but it was severed from every channel that could have preserved and transmitted it with authority. Not the closing of one college, the cutting of a living transmission line, between what a culture had built across generations and the next generation that would have learned it. A door was closed and locked, and the key was held by men with a material reason to keep it locked. If the knowledge being closed out was genuinely useless, if those plant preparations and traditional care practices had been weighed against clinical outcomes and found wanting, none of what followed would have been necessary. Obsolete things fade on their own. They do not require a legal enforcement apparatus. They do not require foundation funding to construct the system that replaces them. Useless knowledge does not need to be outlawed. What came next was an outlawing. The word quackery did not invent itself. It had a function, and the function was precise. Once the schools were closed, once the funding was redirected and the accreditation gate kept, there remained the problem of the practitioners still working. The herbalists, the homeopaths, the botanical pharmacists, the midwives, the eclectic physicians who had trained before the institutional walls came down. They did not stop practicing simply because a report had failed them. They continued seeing patients. Patients continued coming. The knowledge was still there, still moving through communities, still working in the ways it always had. Closing the schools had severed the future, but it had not yet reached the living present. What reached the present was the American Medical Association. As Flexner-aligned institutions consolidated their position through the 1910s, the AMA's power over medical licensing expanded in tandem. State licensing boards, whose composition increasingly reflected the new institutional consensus, acquired the authority to determine who could practice medicine and under what conditions. What had previously been professional competition became, by legal definition, fraud. An herbalist who charged for a consultation was no longer an unlicensed competitor. He was a criminal. A midwife who attended a birth without institutional credentialing was not merely outside the system. She was in violation of it. The language of quackery moved in 3 stages. First, alternative practitioners were called unscientific, a designation without legal force but substantial social weight. Then they were called dangerous. a designation that activated public health frameworks and gave licensing boards grounds for action. Then they were called criminal, a designation that ended careers, destroyed practices, and in some documented cases resulted in prosecution and imprisonment. The progression was not accidental. Each stage built the institutional and legal scaffolding that the next stage required, and each stage was accelerated by an AMA campaign that produced pamphlets, positioned sympathetic journalists, and coordinated with licensing authorities to make the reclassification of traditional practitioners feel like public protection rather than market control. This is the detail that changes the timeline. The Flexner Report did not complete the transformation of American medicine. It initiated the structural phase of a process whose enforcement arm came later. State licensing boards in the 1920s and 1930s moved to restrict, fine, and in documented cases prosecute practitioners operating outside the new credentialing framework, in the coordinated pressure campaigns against individuals who refused to stop working, in the legal mechanisms that made continuing to practice, in the way that thousands of American healers had practiced for decades, an act of defiance that carried real legal consequence. The pharmacy counter is where this becomes visible in the most concrete way. The American pharmacy in 1900 was primarily a compounding operation. The pharmacist worked from raw materials, dried plants, mineral preparations, plant extracts, resins, gums, fixed and volatile oils, blending preparations according to specific patient needs. He understood the chemistry he was working with because he had learned it from first principles, from the material itself. He advised patients on dosage, preparation, and expected response. The pharmacy was a site of genuine knowledge transfer as much as a site of product distribution. The pharmacist was a practitioner, not a clerk. By 1940, that function had largely disappeared. The pharmacist of mid-century dispensed. He counted tablets, affixed labels, and sold pre-manufactured products whose synthesis he had no hand in, whose constituent chemistry he was not expected to understand in any practical sense, and whose dosage had been standardized upstream by a manufacturer operating inside a patented supply chain. The knowledge that had lived in the compounding pharmacist, the accumulated botanical and chemical literacy that took years to develop, had no place in the new model. There was no economic reason to carry it. There was no institutional framework to teach it. And the supply chain that now dominated American pharmaceutical retail had been explicitly reorganized to make it unnecessary. The reorganization had a logic that becomes hard to miss once you look for it. Drug companies funded medical schools that trained prescribers. Those prescribers wrote for patented compounds, insurance systems, developing across exactly this same period, largely under the influence of the same institutional actors who had shaped the Flexner reforms, reimbursed for those compounds and for the hospital services built around surgical and pharmaceutical intervention. Hospitals were constructed and staffed around the same model. Every node of this system reinforced every other node. The architecture was not assembled by coincidence. It was built by people who understood that control of the educational pipeline would determine the shape of everything downstream. Herbal medicine had no equivalent architecture. It could not be insured because it could not be standardized into the billing categories insurance required. It could not be patented because its active agents were natural compounds in the public domain. It could not generate the institutional funding loop that kept medical schools operational, research programs funded, and hospital systems solvent. It was not defeated in a clinical trial. It was defeated in a balance sheet. The system did not win because it demonstrably healed more people across more conditions. It won because it was monetizable in ways the distributed, community-held, non-patentable healing tradition could never be made to be. Now here is the part that requires the most careful attention, because it has been most thoroughly buried. The pharmaceutical industry that rose on the other side of this consolidation did not reject plant knowledge. It extracted from it. Willow bark had been used by healers across multiple continents for centuries to reduce fever and relieve pain. In 1899, Bayer synthesized a chemically modified and stable form of salicylic acid, the willow bark compound, and patented it as aspirin. Foxglove had been used in English folk medicine to treat fluid retention and heart irregularities since at least the 18th century. The pharmaceutical industry extracted digitalis from it, refined the active glycosides, and patented the preparations. Opium poppy had been used medicinally across the ancient world. Morphine, codeine, and eventually the entire opioid pharmaceutical category descend from that plant lineage. The pattern repeats across dozens of compounds. What this means is not that the pharmaceutical industry ignored the old knowledge. It means the industry mined the old knowledge, extracted what was patentable, and discarded what was not. The whole plant preparations, which frequently worked through the interaction of multiple compounds in ratios that evolved over centuries of use, were not proven ineffective. They were simply not reducible to a single patentable molecule. The nutritional protocols, the dietary interventions, the plant-based support for chronic conditions, not tested and found lacking, set aside because they could not anchor a revenue model. What was called superstition was often incomplete science. What was called science was often incomplete medicine. The structural logic established between 1910 and 1940 did not end with that generation. It became a template. Look at what happened to seed knowledge across the following decades. Small farmers in North America had saved, shared, and selectively bred seeds across generations, building a distributed agricultural knowledge base that was locally adapted, publicly held, and entirely outside the commodity system. Beginning in the mid-20th century and accelerating sharply through the 1980s and 1990s, seed patents and intellectual property frameworks were extended to plant varieties in ways that made saving and sharing patented seeds a legal violation. The Monsanto Corporation pursued and in documented cases won lawsuits against farmers found growing its patented genetic material without a license, cases in which farmers argued, without success in court, that the seeds had arrived through accidental wind drift and cross-pollination. The pattern is identical. A body of distributed, non-monetized knowledge, a legal and institutional framework deployed to enclose it, a corporate architecture that replaced community practice with purchased product, and a public language of safety, quality, and efficiency used to frame the enclosure as progress. Nutritional supplements occupy a structurally similar position today. The regulatory approval process required to make a health claim for a supplement, even a plant compound with decades of use and substantial research, runs to costs that only large manufacturers can absorb. The result is not a level playing field between pharmaceutical and natural medicine. It is a system in which the barrier to entry functions as a market-shaping mechanism, reserving the category of approved medicine for products that can support a patent, a supply chain, and an institutional distribution network. The FDA's treatment of natural remedies versus patented pharmaceuticals is not primarily a story of differential efficacy. It is primarily a story of differential approval cost structure, and that structure was not designed neutrally. None of this requires the invention of a conspiracy. It requires only the recognition of incentive. When the people who design a system are the same people who profit from one outcome over another, the system tends over time to produce that outcome. This is not mysterious. It is not even unusual. It is the ordinary behavior of institutions operating in their own financial interest, while speaking the language of public benefit. The betrayal here is not that emergency medicine exists. Surgery works. Antibiotics work. Trauma care, acute infection management, vaccine-preventable disease. These are genuine achievements, and no serious argument against the consolidation of American medicine requires pretending otherwise. The betrayal is narrower and more specific. It is that one system was permitted to become the only approved system, and the approval mechanism was controlled by the same financial interests that benefited from the outcome. Families lost access to remedies their grandparents knew not, because those remedies were measured against rigorous outcomes and found wanting, but because the institution that now held the authority to define medicine had no financial interest in teaching them. The thing that was removed was not primitive. It was inconvenient. Go back to that photograph from 1897, the Cincinnati pharmacy. The shelves packed with amberglass and dried root, and ceramic jars and handwritten remedy cards. The pharmacist who knew each substance by name and action and preparation, and who could reach for something specific because he had been trained in a living tradition. By 1925, most of those bottles were gone. But here is what the official account does not say. The people who filled them did not stop knowing what they knew. Some of it survived in immigrant households, where certain preparations were made quietly and passed forward without the language to name what they were. Some of it survived in native communities that had never fully surrendered their plant traditions to a system that had never been designed with their well-being in mind. Some of it survived in the margins, in the practices of individual healers who continued working in communities that still needed them, in the rural and the poor and the overlooked places where institutional medicine had not yet fully arrived. That survival was not celebrated, it was not funded, it was not integrated into the educational or insurance frameworks that would have given it continuity and broader reach. It persisted the way things persist when they are useful, and the people who carry them have no other option, quietly, incompletely, without the authority that formal transmission confers. Think about what that means. Think about the grandmother who knew which plants grew at the edge of the field and what each one was for, and who had no language to give her grandchildren, because the language had been removed from the institutions where it should have been taught. Think about the knowledge that died with her, not because it was wrong, but because no one had been permitted to teach it in the decades between her learning it and her death. That is not the natural death of old ideas. That is the managed disappearance of inconvenient ones. If herbal knowledge was merely the superstition of an earlier age, there was no need to remove it from schools, prosecute the people who taught it, defund the institutions that trained it, and redesign an entire profession around its absence. Superstitions do not require institutional force to die. They fade when better explanations arrive. That much force does not go into burying something useless. It goes into burying something that works.